The reception following Queen Avrith's ruling on the contested waters dispute had the particular quality of events where the public performance and the private reality were running simultaneously on different tracks. Publicly, three noble houses satisfied with the proceedings, grateful for the Queen's deliberation, confident in the wisdom of Thessari governance. Thomas Vael, 4 years into his posting as junior aide to Ambassador Chen, had attended enough of these events to read the public performance fluently. Privately, Vethkaran's delegation were almost satisfied and knew they should have pushed harder on the northern boundary provisions. Lorvesh's people were embarrassed about the lineage reframing attempt and trying not to show it. Sethara's house had gotten the mineral rights allocation they actually needed, and were performing more disappointment than they felt to avoid appearing to have one too clearly. Thomas stood near the eastern wall, approximately 3 meters from the nearest cluster of diplomatic staff, waiting for Ambassador Chen to complete the conversations she needed to complete before they could depart. His role at this point was presence, the quiet professional availability of someone who might be needed and therefore should remain accessible without occupying space that mattered. He had been in this role, in this position, at events like this one, enough times that he could occupy it while also occupying his own thoughts with something else. He was thinking about the ruling. Specifically, he was thinking about 9 hours of testimony he'd watched from the Eastern Gallery, and the particular quality of attention he'd observed in the woman who had to listen to all of it while also being the person who would ultimately decide. Avrith appeared at his elbow, the young Thessari court logistics official who Thomas had worked with across enough events to have developed the particular comfortable ease of professional acquaintance that stops requiring social maintenance. Avrith handed him a glass of something and made the non-committal remark that Thessari court officials made about proceedings that had gone the way proceedings were supposed to go. Thomas was off duty in the way that junior diplomatic staff were off duty at the tail end of events where the work was done, and the rest was theater. Off duty in the sense that nothing he said was being logged or assessed or would appear in any document that mattered. He said what he thought. She listened to all of it, Thomas said, keeping his voice low, not secretive, just calibrated to the space and the conversation rather than the room. 9 hours. Vethkaran's people spent the last 2 hours repeating arguments from the morning session. Avrith made a sound that might have been agreement. And she tracked the inconsistencies, Thomas continued. There was a point in the afternoon, somewhere around hour 6, where one of Vethkaran's secondary representatives made a claim about historical usage rights that contradicted something their lead representative had said in hour 2. She caught it, asked about it specifically. He paused. You could see her doing the work. It wasn't performed attention. He was looking somewhere toward the middle distance of the hall rather than at Avrith specifically. The way people look when they're thinking through something rather than performing a conversation. And when Lorvesh tried that lineage reframing near the end, he stopped for a moment because the memory of it was worth pausing over. He'd been building to it for about 40 minutes. That whole section of testimony was groundwork for the reframe. It was fairly elegant, actually, as tactics go. Avrith, who had been in the chamber as part of logistics support, made the small sound of someone who remembered the moment. She didn't get angry, Thomas said. She didn't perform patience either, that thing where you can see someone waiting out a tactic they've already dismissed. She asked him 3 questions. 3 specific questions in sequence, and each one required an answer that made the next question necessary. By the end of the 3rd answer, the reframe had dismantled itself. He shook his head slightly. She let the answers do the work. He almost left it there. The thought was complete. That's restraint, he said instead to the middle distance. Not the performed kind, actual restraint, not raising her voice, not demonstrating that she'd seen through it, just asking questions that required honest answers. You don't get that often. His voice dropped slightly, the way voices drop when someone is thinking out loud rather than making a speech. A ruler who listens because she's trying to decide. Not because the protocol requires the appearance of listening. It changes what she can actually decide. A pause. She earned that ruling. He said this the way people say true things that have just finished being understood. Not just the authority to make it, the content of it, that came from the listening. He intended to stop there. He didn't entirely stop there. 9 hours is a long time to actually pay attention, he said, half to himself. Most people don't. The change happened the way these things happened in formal Thessari spaces, gradually, in the peripheral awareness, before the conscious mind caught up. Thomas became aware first that Avrith had gone still. Not the stillness of someone who'd stopped talking because the conversation had reached a natural pause. The different stillness of someone who'd stopped moving. The ambient noise of the reception thinned. Not the whole hall, but the immediate vicinity, the sound environment of the 12 to 15 people closest to where he was standing. The particular quality of people pausing in conversation because their attention had been claimed by something. He was aware of the shadow before he turned toward it. A shift in the hall's overhead lighting, something present and tall now standing just behind and to his left. Close, not crowding the space, but close in the way that made his skin aware of proximity before his mind had finished processing what proximity meant. The room around him had done the thing rooms did when the center of gravity moved. Her voice came from just behind his shoulder. Repeat it. 2 words, not sharp. There was no edge in them, no amusement either, no performance of catching him at something. Simply clear, the way a request is clear when the person making it has decided to make it and sees no reason to dress it in anything additional. Thomas went still. The stillness was involuntary, the body doing its own processing ahead of conscious thought. He was aware, with the specific hyper-awareness that arrived in moments like this one, of every word he had said in the past 3 minutes, which he had meant. All of which he had meant, without calculation or strategy, offered in the low register of someone talking to a colleague they trusted, not intended to travel the distance it had apparently traveled. Around him, in the peripheral awareness he was still managing despite everything, the reception had reorganized. The nearest clusters of nobles and diplomatic staff had become an audience in the specific way that proximity to a watching queen transformed everyone into audience whether they intended it or not. He turned. Queen Avrith was standing 2 steps behind him. She was looking at him with an expression that declined to be readable. Not warm, not cold, not testing, not performing anything. Simply present and attentive, in the way that she had been present and attentive for 9 hours in the chamber, which Thomas had apparently watched closely enough to recognize. She was waiting. Thomas had 3 seconds, approximately, in which his mind ran through the available options with the rapid efficiency of someone who had been in enough complicated diplomatic situations to triage quickly. He could soften it, dress it in the formal register, make it sound like prepared praise offered with awareness of the audience, make it something that the room would recognize as an appropriate response to an unexpected situation. He could do this, and it would be visible to anyone paying attention as exactly what it was. The retreat from sincerity into performance, the thing people did when honesty suddenly became exposed and expensive. He could apologize for the informality of the phrasing, for the presumptuousness of offering observation about a queen's conduct in a semi-public space without having been asked. That was also a kind of retreat, and also visible. He could repeat what he'd said. Not because any calculation told him to. Because he'd meant it, and the only version of himself he knew how to be in the next 10 seconds was the one who'd meant it. He held her eyes. This required something. She was the queen of the Thessari ascendancy, and the room was watching, and the room expected him to look at the floor or the wall or anywhere that acknowledged the appropriate distance. He looked at her, and he repeated it. Not recitation, not the word-for-word performance of recall. The substance of it, in the same low register he'd used when he thought he was talking to Avrith and the hall's eastern wall. That she'd listened for 9 hours rather than performing patience. That she'd tracked the inconsistency in Vethkaran's testimony across a 4-hour gap, which meant she'd been absorbing and retaining rather than processing and releasing. That the 3 questions to Lorvesh had been constructed to let the answers dismantle the reframe rather than announcing she'd seen through it. That the restraint was real, not performed. That he knew the difference because performed restraint had a quality of waiting, of someone sitting behind their own patience, and this hadn't had that. That the content of the ruling had come from the listening, which was different from the authority to rule, which she would have had regardless. He finished and stopped. He didn't qualify it or apologize for it or add anything that softened the directness of having said it twice to her face, when once to a colleague's peripheral attention had already been more exposure than he'd intended. He stopped because that was what she'd asked for and he'd given it. The silence extended. Thomas was aware of his own heartbeat, which was doing something he'd prefer it wasn't doing, and of the room's collective stillness, which had the quality of people who expected something to happen and were waiting to see what form it would take. Something moved in Avrith's expression. Not dramatically, Not the visible performance of being moved that he'd watched some officials deploy when they wanted the room to know they were moved. Something smaller, a shift at the edges of it, in the quality of attention she was directing at him. As if the repetition had confirmed something the first iteration had suggested, and the confirmation had landed somewhere. "You watched from the Eastern Gallery," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that the nobles at the nearest distance probably caught the cadence without the content. "Yes, Your Majesty." "For the full session?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment in which he had no framework for what she was assessing or what she was deciding. "Then you know what it cost," she said, still quiet, still the register of a conversation rather than a performance. Thomas, who had been in the Eastern Gallery for 9 hours and had watched the afternoon session when the testimony was clearly repetitive and clearly designed to exhaust rather than inform, and had watched her face during it, said, "Yes." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen, but the silence of something that had already happened and had not yet been named. Avrith said, "That was well observed, Aide Vael, and well said both times." She moved on into the reception, turned and moved with the same unhurried deliberateness she'd moved with all day. And the room's center of gravity moved with her, and the conversations that had thinned resumed themselves, and the hall became a hall again. Thomas found a section of wall to stand near. His legs had the quality they sometimes had after certain kinds of sustained tension, not weak exactly, but aware of themselves in a way that made standing seem like an active choice rather than a passive state. He stood and processed. The words had been true. He'd said them the first time because they were true, without audience, without calculation, because Avrith had made a non-committal remark, and Thomas had been thinking about 9 hours of watching and had said what he thought. He'd said them the second time because retreating from truth when it was seen felt like a worse option than standing in it. He wasn't certain that was wisdom. He was certain it was what he was. Avrith materialized beside him after approximately 90 seconds. The careful 90 seconds of someone who'd watched the exchange from approximately 2 meters away, and was now performing the casual reappearance of someone who'd been nearby all along. That, Avrith said very quietly, was either extremely brave or extremely fortunate. Thomas considered this. "Neither," he said. "I said the same thing twice. You said it to her face the second time. She asked me to." Avrith looked at him with an expression that suggested this distinction was failing to land the way Thomas thought it should land. "You didn't soften it," Avrith said. "It would have been visible," Thomas said, "and it was true. Softening it would have made it less true." Avrith was quiet for a moment. She said it was well observed. "Yes, she doesn't say things like that during receptions. In my experience of receptions, which is extensive." Thomas didn't respond to this immediately because he was thinking about what she'd said just before that. About the Eastern Gallery, about the full session, about knowing what it cost. The quietness of those words. The register of them, which hadn't been public even though they were spoken in a public space. He thought about the question she hadn't asked directly, but had made space for him to answer. Not "do you know what I do," but "do you know what it costs?" The difference between those questions was the difference between observing a performance and witnessing something real. He'd said yes. He'd meant it. He thought about why she'd asked for the repetition. Not to embarrass him. If that had been the purpose, the dismissal would have come after and the room would have known what it was. Not to perform gratitude for the room, because what she'd said at the end had been too quiet for performance. To hear it again, he thought. Not for the flattery. The thing he'd said wasn't flattery, and she'd been ruling long enough to know the difference. For the confirmation. For what it meant that someone who had no reason to tell her, who had been standing at the hall's edge talking quietly to a logistics official, thought it was visible. The thing she was trying to be. The queen she was working to be, through 9-hour sessions and 3 precise questions and restraint that was real rather than performed. Visible. To someone who wasn't looking for it, who wasn't paid to find it, who had nothing to earn from saying so. He wasn't certain he'd understood it completely. He was certain he'd understood something. She wanted to know if it was visible, he said, partly to Avrith and partly to himself. Not the ruling, what went into it. Avrith considered this, and I told her it was. Thomas looked out at the hall, at the reception continuing around them, at Queen Avrith moving through it with the same quality of present attention he'd watched for 9 hours in a stone chamber. Twice. He found his glass, which he'd set on a nearby surface at some point during the preceding minutes, and finished what was in it. "That's all it was," he said. Avrith, who had been a court logistics official for 6 years and had watched a great many receptions, said nothing. The nothing had a quality to it, though, the quality of someone who thought more had happened than the other person was accounting for and was deciding whether to say so. He decided not to. And Thomas stood near the eastern wall, where he'd been standing when he said the first thing, and waited for Ambassador Chen, and thought about what it meant to observe something true and say so, once to the hall's indifferent air, and once to the face of the person the truth was about. Twice the same, different entirely,